House of Drear, Chapter 8, Part 2. Well, said Mrs. Small, as though to answer Thomas and clear their thinking at the same time. She looked searchingly at Mr. Small. Mr. Pluto is the strangest man, isn't he? I mean, you never told me he was such a huge man and such an odd-acting man. Well, he didn't seem, began Mr. Small. I mean to say, he wasn't at all. For the second time this night, Thomas watched his father become rigid, his face controlled by an instant spasm. Mr. Small rose swiftly from the table. And here we have the again and again notice and note signpost. I feel like here we have something that Mr. Small is doing. Thomas said that he watched his father's face become rigid, controlled by an instant spasm. And if you look on our bookmark, it says that when you see something, a word or phrase, object or situation that comes again and again, you need to stop and ask yourself, why does this keep showing up again and again? So a question that I would ask myself is, why does Thomas keep noticing his father's facial expression, and why does his father's facial expression seem to be tight and rigid? We won't talk anymore about Pluto tonight, he said. But Papa, Thomas protested, we just got going on him. Tomorrow's Sunday, Thomas, Mr. Small said sternly. Mrs. Small sucked in her breath. Sunday, she said. My goodness, how in the world did I forget? I don't have our clothes unpacked. She looked worried. I can't remember where I put my hat boxes. Oh, for heaven's sake, said Mr. Small. There will be plenty of time for your hat box search in the morning if we all go to bed now. Thomas, you go ahead. Your room is at the end of the hall, on the right side as you go down the hall. Get your pajamas out of the suitcase and your towel, too. Don't forget your toothbrush. It's going to be Sunday, all right, Thomas said. We'll probably meet just everybody. I don't doubt that, said Mr. Small. I did want to see the house tonight, though, Thomas said. He looked around at the lopsided kitchen. I can tell straight off this room is smaller than it should be. That's because you've had time to see the house from the outside, Mr. Small said. Let me see if I can figure it out, said Thomas. I want you to go to bed. Here, said his father. I'll show you myself to save time. On either side of the kitchen door there were sliding panels, which vanished into the wall at Mr. Small's touch. Within were arched cubicles large enough for a man stooping to hide. Why, I wouldn't have imagined, said Mrs. Small. That's great, Thomas said. Boy, I wouldn't have thought they were there either. A very temporary measure, Mr. Small said. Slaves might be hidden in these walls for a short time, until the trap door could be raised so they could escape through the tunnel. Old Drear thought of everything, Thomas said, clearly impressed. Now go upstairs, Mr. Small said. The twins have the room across from yours, so be quiet. We'll be up shortly. Papa, you won't be able to get locks tomorrow, Thomas said, because it's going to be Sunday. Maybe I can find out where a locksmith lives, Mr. Small answered. I did forget for a minute that it would be Sunday. You go on up. Good night. Thomas went up to his room, treading softly down the carpeted hallway. The hall was not well lighted, and the ceiling was very high. There were closed, varnished doors on either side. Tall and dark, they didn't seem at all friendly. Why do I have to be so far away from the stairs? Thomas wondered. I'll never be able to hear a sound back here. He stopped long enough to find out if he could hear his mother and father talking. The silence made him feel he was smothering. That proves it, he said. You wouldn't be able to hear anything coming or going. You'd just be a sitting duck. He thought of looking in all the rooms before going into his own bedroom, and he did march up to one floor about halfway down the hall. For some reason, he couldn't bring himself to turn the knob. Better wait until tomorrow, he told himself, and backed away from the door. At his own door at the end of the hall, he held on tightly to the doorknob but didn't turn it. It was a brass knob. It felt cold. He looked across the hall, seeing the twins' rooms. Their door was open, and the yellow nightlight shone through the darkness. Gathering his courage, Thomas opened the door to his room and was at once blinded by the bright light. There was a clear glass globe suspended by a chain from the ceiling. The room was larger than he could have hoped, with a narrow fireplace to his left at the far end There were 2 long windows across from him. His bed had been placed between them, facing the door. There were smaller garret windows on each side of the fireplace. Directly in front of the fireplace was a large, old-fashioned captain's chair. It was a ghostly chair with its back to the room. It faced the bare, charred insides of the cold hearth. Thomas had the awful notion that someone he couldn't see was sitting in it. "Hello," he said. "Who do you think you are?" He hoped to startle anyone who might be there into some sudden movement. He still held onto the doorknob, half in and half out of the room. He could yell and run fast down the hall if he had to. There was no movement from the chair. There was no sound of any kind in the room except his own breathing. He came cautiously inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. Going up to the chair at an angle, he saw that it was empty. At the same moment, he noticed that he was cold and clammy. "Whose old chair is it anyway?" he said out loud. The chair wasn't one that had come from their home in North Carolina. Its cumbersome, hard seat and back were upholstered with faded leather. The flat wood armrests were not even carved, and the base of it, made from the same hardwood, sat squarely on the floor. "I've got to move it," Thomas said to himself. "I'll never get to sleep if I don't turn it around." As he struggled to move the heavy chair, he thought of 50 ways to get even with old Pluto for putting the chair with its back to the room. "He did it just to scare me. He's just a mean old man," Thomas thought. But he couldn't move the chair no matter how hard he tried. He couldn't slide it on the gray, musty carpet, and he could not tilt it and swivel it the way his mother did when she had to move furniture. And that's odd to me. I'm going to stop for just a second because I made a note to the side of this. Why won't the chair move? It can't be so heavy that Thomas can't budge it, so why won't it move? Mr. Pluto had arranged the room with the same plan in mind as he must have had when he'd arranged the front parlor. Thomas began to form a plan of his own as he went about getting ready for bed. He wasn't going to sleep in the room, that was for certain. Not until I change everything. Not until I get that chair into some corner. Thomas's old bookcase stood next to his bed, blocking the view from the lower half of the windows. On the other side of his bed, a crate of his books had been placed with great care. On top of that, his father had flung the smaller carton full of his carvings. There was a note attached to it as a reminder